All right, guys, welcome. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I assume a lot of people probably still think it's 7 because that's usually we're 7 to 9, but hopefully we get or join. I'll keep admitting as they show up. I've got 6 p.m. Just a couple quick, brief admin announcements. The call chat newsletter should be out within the week. In our editor's hands right now. I have one more article to add, but then should be ready to go.
We're calling that the summer edition, is that right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
So since there's not a real season at the moment. Our next meeting will be our call shot standard time, which is 2 weeks from today, noon to 2. And it'll be Frank Amoroso talking about his 3 books, the Whopper series on the Babe Ruth historical fiction. I just finished the 3rd one actually a few days ago. I do apologize. I never realized for some of our earlier meetings, I guess I didn't record them. So some of like Tom Stone and DB are not on the SABR website or YouTube page because apparently I wasn't recording. But luckily those authors have spoken for other chapters so you can see their presentations. Don't worry, Bernard, we're recording, and we did get Bill Nowlin's presentation from last month's meeting. That's online now too. So I'll let Dr. McKenna take it away, talk about his book, Baltimore Black Sox. Bernard is one of the handful of gentlemen we should thank for having a Baltimore chapter, along with Dave Stinson and Bruce and a few others who worked for years to kind of get it off the ground. So Dr. McKenna is a professor at University of Delaware. He is a Baltimore native. He can let you know about where he grew up and all that kind of stuff. I have finished it. It's wonderful, very well researched. I don't know a lot about the Negro leagues, but I'm learning as time goes on, that's for sure. And hopefully he'll be doing a presentation next summer at SABR 50. So Bernard, go right ahead.
All right, thank you, Peter. I wish we were all together at the brewery right now, and I wish we had the opportunity to meet in person. Yesterday was a little bit of an interesting day. If you live on the eastern shore of Maryland or in Delaware, we had so far 4 recorded tornadoes that went through, and power goes out intermittently. So if I get cut off, I'll try to get back on right away. So otherwise, I think we'll be good for the next couple of hours, and I hope you have lots of questions. I do want to start out with something that is only tangentially related to the Black Sox. I discovered a photo that relates to Baltimore baseball history, and I thought I'd share that with everybody first. Now, how does it relate to the Black Sox? I will read you a bit from, you have the book, it's on page 36. Starting in 1908, the Weldons played their games in an enclosed field on McComas and Light Streets in South Baltimore. Now, that's Union League Park. This is distinct from Union Park, where the Orioles played, and Union Park at Belair Lot, which was the venue for a team in the, I think, of the American Association in 1882 or thereabouts. Ken Mars would know more about that, but this is Union League Park. And I'll give you a little bit of the history of that. I give it in my book, but I want to show you, first of all, let me go share screen. Hang on. See if I can get this done. Peter, can you enable me to share screen? And I'll share the photos. And just let me know. What I can do is I can give you a little bit of history of the park first. It was built in 1906 as the stadium grounds. It was at the time of its construction the second largest sports venue in the city, with a capacity of about 3,500. It was intended to be Baltimore's home in the Union League of Professional Baseball Clubs, which really didn't last more than a couple of weeks. Union League Park was an intimate setting. And this is from what I describe, it's in the book, but it's from the memoirs of a woman who lived on Charles Street, just behind Union League Park. And she describes that her father would sit up on the roof and watch ball games. And men would lower an empty bottle and 6 cents to the street, where a boy would take it to Hamburger Saloon to be filled up and sent back up to the roof. Over the left field fence sat the Pennsylvania and Western rail yards, just to the south and east of Donaldson Street at Port Covington. At the time when segregation and racial tensions ran high in city neighborhoods to the north, this area of South Baltimore was an integrated community where people were treated with, and this is quoting, respect and kindness, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. Lower Hanover Street was called Checkerboard Road because African-American families, Chinese immigrants, and European immigrants lived together. Anyway, so and the Weldons, when they played there, they would have fans that came in from other parts of the city. It was well served by the streetcars. And they brought a brass band to their home games. And the Baltimore Sun warned white fans that noise instruments of all kinds will be bought by the colored rooters for a game against a white club. So this is Union League Park. Let me see if I can share it now. Yeah, now this is a photo, not of Union League Park, but I want you to notice some things. This is a shot from the Hanover Street Bridge to what is now, I think, Nick's Fish House. And I'm going to enlarge this photo if I can. Yeah, to show you, I want you to take note of these. If you can see my cursor, there's 4 points right there, the water tower on top there, and these points here. Because this is proof that the photo I'm about to show you is of Union League Park. And I write in my book that there are no extant photos of it. But now, right here, see the markings in the background? They're the same buildings. So this is what Union League Park looked like from the inside. There are 2 other shots of Union League Park in this series. These photos are the property of the Baltimore Museum of Industry.
Bernard, we're still seeing the same first photo. You're
still seeing, okay, hang on, let me stop share. I'm gonna have to stop share and then go back in then. Are you seeing it now?
Not yet. Well, now there's a base runner being tagged out.
Right, good. Now look on the top of the screen and you see these are the buildings in the background. It's the same one. So this is Union League Park. And so there are 2 other shots in this sequence, one of the outside of the ballpark and another one of the inside of the ballpark. But this is the money shot because it shows you, it confirms that these photos are of Union League Park. Now, I'm going to pull this off the screen right away because those photos can't be reproduced without permission of the Museum of Industry. So, I mean, they don't charge much, but it's their copyright. And they sent them to me on the condition that I wouldn't publish them. I may write something up for Baltimore Chop, and then if that happens, or another magazine for it. They were just donated to them. And I was looking through, just because we all have this disease. I was looking at baseball and some photo archives, and I ran across that and 2 others. And so if I can, without too much effort, I'll try to pull up the 2 others before the meeting's over, and you can take a look at them. So they're perfectly related to the Negro League. But in 1909, the predecessors to the Black Sox, the Baltimore Giants, played there as members. The Weldons played there. The Baltimore Giants played there. And the Baltimore Giants were at the time members of the National Association, I think, of professional colored baseball clubs. So let me get that exact quote for you of what
Bernard, while you're looking for that, there's one I would like to ask you about that previous one.
Yeah.
When you talked about the checkerboard road,
Yep.
your footnote there, or your end note, refers to hardware and house furnishing goods. How in the world?
Does it?
did you
Well, okay,
track that down?
hang on. I'll check my note in a second. But let me give you, so it's the Colored Professional Baseball Association. So it was a professional colored league. So if in a subsequent edition of Green Mansions, I think Union League Park can be included. So there are 3 extant photos of Union League Park. And that's, I just showed you one. I might show you the other 2. So let me check on that. Hang on. So it's,
On page 170. I mean, you did some deep diving. If that's where you went.
okay, 170, is that the right chapter? Because you have
I think
chapter 1 there.
I went to 24 in chapter. Oh man! Oh, you're
I
right.
think it's chapter 2.
Well, I'm still fascinated by that one.
Yeah, it's chapter 2. It's on 172. So
No,
if you
you're
look,
right, you're right.
Helen Granger Boss. This is
Yeah.
So she published. There are 2 places where she spoke about it. One is it was written in an article in the Baltimore Sun on May 20th or May 30th, 1965, and it's called "I Remember Riverside Scenes in Old South Baltimore." Also, the University of Baltimore has her memoirs. They're unpublished, but Helen Granger Bowles. Those are her reflections on it. And her grandson, I spoke with her grandson, and he said there used to be a family photo of Union League Park from the roof of the houses on South Charles Street. And he said it was gorgeous. And he said they can't find it. And they just assume it was destroyed in a flood. And just imagine for a moment having that shot and seeing that field open up where the Black Sox and other semi-pro teams played. But it's a particular note because it's the Baltimore Black Sox. So anyway, I wanted to let everybody know that news. It's relatively recent. David Stinson knows about that photo, and the people at the Museum of Industry know about that photo, but nobody else knows yet. But now you all do know about that photo, know about the view from it. And again, as I said, if I can pull it up, I know exactly where they take me to 30 seconds. So towards the end of my talk tonight, I can go in and pull up the other photos of it. They're really interesting, but it's not about the Baltimore Black Sox, and that's really why I'm here to talk about them tonight. And I thought that I could begin by talking about the book and giving a survey of the book. I thought we might do it in a little bit of a backwards way. I know that many of you have questions because you emailed me and said you have questions. Well, so he gets hit by a pitch, he gets examined by a doctor and presumably the clubhouse or the dugout. The doctor says, it's not a really good idea for you to go back in. Rob Dixon goes back into the game. Presumably he makes an out. And for a long time I thought, well, maybe I discovered something. Maybe he, one extra time because he was hit by a pitch. But no, apparently he made an out after that. And Ted might know the specifics about this. 16 straight plane passes. And then for a while I thought it was 17 because hit by a pitch. But no. And the reason I say that, even though I couldn't find any evidence for it, is because his teammates and the papers were keeping track of the plate appearances. And so they tell us that's 16. And that, and so that's one of the reasons I think those 3 men are men who should be considered, played for the Black Sox, spent considerable time with the team, who should be considered for the Hall of Fame. I think a case could be made for Lamont Yoakley, who played with those teams also. But I think Beckworth, Lundy, Gus Marcel in 1929 could be part of the team. One of the stories I'll tell is about Beckworth's temper. There was an incident in Harrisburg where, and I'll tell it, it's 2 stories I'll tell about Beckworth. One, how he joined the Black Sox, and secondly, about his temper. So, but before I go on with that, does anyone have any questions about Rap Dixon or Hall of Fame for the Black Sox? It's something we can come back to. But I'm monitoring the chat now. And again, Ted's the expert here on Rap Dixon, and he can make his case far better than I can. But another man is Doc Sykes, whose career was over before the Eastern Colored League began. He played some games in the Eastern Colored League with another team, but really his career was over. His heyday was in the late teens and early 20s. And he pitched a no-hitter or a perfect game against a Major League All-Star team in this period as well. He was a dentist. That's why he was called Doc. And he had pitched a little bit for the Lincoln Giants in Philadelphia. Or no, sorry, Lincoln Giants in New York. And he was working his way through Howard University for dental school by pitching for them in the summer. And so Charlie Spedden discovered him, whatever that means, and recruited him as one of 3 pitchers for the Black Sox in 1918, when they were desperate for ball players. Spedden took over the team in late 1917, and the Black Sox had fallen on hard times. And so Spedden saw it as his job to reestablish the team in Baltimore. And we can talk about why in a minute. There's the ballpark at Westport. But so he was ready for that. What he wasn't ready for was the draft. And 12 Black Sox players were drafted in 1918 to serve in the First World War. So he lost those ball players that spring. And he had to scour the country. And brought one in from the Pacific Coast League, another pitcher came in from Cuba, and Doc Sykes. And Sykes dominated the league for a few years, winning 30 games in one of those years. And again, he no-hit on perfect game against a Major League All-Star team in that period of time. And after his playing career was over, he went home to work. He was in the South. And he was called to testify in the Scottsboro case. And that's something it's where some young African-American men were unjustly accused of harming a white woman. And it looked like they were going to be railroaded and perhaps lynched or convicted and sentenced to death. And he testified on their behalf. And there's a famous picture of Sykes sitting in the courtroom in a chair with a suit, tie, looking every bit the professional. And in exchange for his testimony, the Ku Klux Klan burnt a cross on his lawn, his home, and his dental office. So if we're talking about contributions to baseball and not just excellence in career, I think Doc Sykes should also be mentioned. But I think Rap Dixon, John Beckwith, Dick Lundy are the top 3, with men like Doc Sykes, Lamont Yoakley, and some others due for consideration as well. And I make the point that I think the Maryland Sports Hall of Fame should consider some of these men too, and far more of them. And so if you're talking about the Maryland Sports Hall of Fame, I think Charlie Spedden should be up for consideration. John R. Williams, Howard Young, Charlie Thomas, Charles Evans, other men who were instrumental in the early years of the Black Sox and contributed a lot to Baltimore City. And so it's one of those things that, maybe now that this is opening up, and this goes to Bruce's question. Do you and/or Ted believe that Dixon has been so overwhelmingly, why do you think he's been so overwhelmingly overlooked even among SABR members? Well, I can't answer to the SABR members, but I think that many players who played for the Negro leagues in the 19-teens and 1920s are overlooked because it's hard to get histories of those times. I think things are getting easier. I write this in the book about digitization has enabled us to do in just a few hours, and many of you are in the same business that I am, research, has enabled us to do in a few hours what used to take months. Larry Lester tells a great story about traveling to university archives in search of a box score and going through sheets and sheets of microfilm. And and we've all done this. I'm 50, how old I am, 53, 54. And I remember as an undergraduate and later as a graduate student doing something similar for Irish literature and being in archives in Dublin or in Belfast, London, looking through them for just obscure bits of information. And now you can get that information within minutes from your home. So this is one of those things that it's changing. So I think that the books like the Baltimore Black Sox are going to be written with increasing frequency. And I also want to say something about, so that's the answer to the Bruce's question, because people don't know their story. And I think if people knew the stories of men like Rap Dixon and Doc Sykes and Dick Lundy, and not just the names, but the statistics, and Seamheads is doing an exceptional job fleshing those out. I think people would, I think they would be. Also, I think there's a tendency to say that, oh, well, we really can't measure their ability because they didn't play against top of the line competition, right? Especially in the 1920s. And I think I flinch when I hear that, because they played against the best competition they could play against. And they excelled. I mean, Judd Wilson hit 495 one year. And this, I know that Seamheads has a different average for that year. But if you look at the paper, and so, you know, while you say, well, he played semi-pro, well, you know, it's not his fault. He would have played in the major leagues. I'd like to have seen how he did, but we can only measure him for what he did, not what he would have done if he were in the majors, etc. I mean, what would Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Rogers Hornsby, how would they have performed if they had to face Mon Yoakley or Doc Sykes or any of the other whose men we don't know their name because of the color of their skin. And I know that there are some people who advocate for this too, that might be Todd Peterson, maybe. There's should we have different statistics after 1947? And should that be the cutoff? You know, because baseball really didn't integrate in 47. It had Jackie Robinson, Larry Gobe, et cetera, but it didn't really become an integrated sport until the late 50s, early 60s. So, you know, what do we do about these? So that's why, I mean, that's, Bruce, I'm answering your question about this, about why are they overlooked? Because people don't know their stories. And I think books like the Black Sox can be written now, whereas they couldn't be written even 10 years ago because of the digitization of African-American newspapers. And I think newspapers.com does a nice job of making things available, Chicago Defender, et cetera. The Afro-American is sometimes available on the web, sometimes not. It's not on newspapers.com, but fortunately I have a university affiliation, so I can get it. I can get ProQuest Historic Black Papers, that's what it's called. And then you can search the Afro-American, or if you're in the Baltimore area, you can access it through the Pratt Library or the Baltimore County Library. And you can get those databases and they can come together for you. So anyway, that's some of those stories. So right now we've covered idea about Hall of Fame for the Black Sox players. And I spoke briefly about Union League Park in the beginning. And I told some stories about Doc Sykes. So let me transition next into talking about some of the myths that or not myths, but untruths that people were accepting so readily. Daniel Nathan, in his 2 articles on the Black Sox, has done tremendous work on the team. And it was his article about the Black Sox, one of his 2, that discovered that they were not founded in 1916, they were founded in 1913. And their first owner was Howard Young. And John Earl Williams was their treasurer and secretary. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Howard Young and a little bit about John Earl Williams. But in order to appreciate the impact of those men and the import to the team and ultimately to the city, I'll talk a little bit more about the origins of the team. And I had done part of this for SABR, about 5 years ago. And presentation, as soon as I discovered it, that the team was founded in 1905. And its name was not the Black Sox, it was named the Weldon Athletic Association. And the Weldons were founded by a man named Wallace Smith, who was at that point, 41 years old. And he had been born a slave in a place called Sudlanderville, Maryland. Now, I don't know whether that's near Sudlersville where Jimmy Fox was born and raised or not, because I can't find it on an atlas. But I suppose it was, because they mentioned in Sudlanderville that was from the Eastern Shore. So it may have been close by. And he was born into slavery. And now, if well, how is that? Because of the Emancipation Proclamation, because of the Civil War. Well, Maryland was a slaveholding state. It wasn't in rebellion, it was a border state. So slavery was still in effect. It was one of 4 states: Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, and Kentucky. So he was born into slavery. His father died at the Siege of Petersburg, fighting for the Union Army, which meant he had to escape from slavery to do that. So Wallace Smith and his brother Thomas were raised by their mother as a single mother, and they became entrepreneurs. How, I don't know. It's one of those stories that's lost to history. But the family owned a coal and coke company, distribution business in Baltimore. And so they made their wealth there. And they would later found Smith's Hotel. And Thomas would be the business brains behind that. But in 1905, the Weldon Athletic Club formed, and its founder was Wallace Smith. And he was their first manager, general manager, owner, publicity agent. And if you look into any of the newspapers in Baltimore, the Sun paper, the Baltimore American, the Baltimore News, Baltimore Star, any ever, you see that there were dozens, if not hundreds, of amateur and semi-pro teams in the city at that time. So how did the Weldons stand out? Well, we don't know how, but let's say some money was behind it. It was a semi-pro team, so it was legal. But the Weldons imported players from the region who could really play baseball. And they likely scouted out good ball players from the city, like June Matthews, who was their shortstop, and O.J. Barber, who was their center fielder, and Ed Wise, who was their catcher. And a guy whose name is Fawkes, and I can't find his first name anywhere. He was their star pitcher. So he had it up the middle. Great ball players. And he called out in the announcement, the Weldon's team is organized, etc. He says, we'll welcome games against any team. But he said, especially against Joe Gans. And Joe Gans was, as you know, the first African-American boxing champ. There was a black British man, an Anglo African man, who was a boxing champ before Gans. But Gans was the first African-American boxing champ. His statue is in Madison Square Garden. And I think there should be a statue in Baltimore City to him. And he was raised in Fells Point, and he would work in the Broadway market in any case. So Joe Gans was also a great semi-professional baseball player. The Baltimore Sun called his fielding, quote, clever. And at the plate he was, quoting the Sun, a terror. Now, I go into this in the book. The Baltimore Sun fomented racial hatred in the period. They made up stories wholesale in their news pages. The sports pages were immune from that. I haven't found, and now a lot of that was because the teams would write their own stories and send them all. But I haven't found anything in the sports pages against either Joe Gans, any of the African-American ball players, or Jack Johnson. But those negative stories were in the news pages, and you can find them against Johnson, against Gans, against the Black Sox, but not in sports pages. But the sports writer called him, and I thought the use of the word clever was particularly instructive because it talked about his intellect. But so Wallace Smith calls out Joe Gans in the paper. He said, welcome a game against Joe Gans. And then about a week later, Gans answers, and he's furious, and he writes, we are the champion team in Maryland, champion semi-pro team in Maryland. And despite what other people are saying, and we accept Wallace. So I inferred from this that there was other talk going on outside the newspapers. Despite what other people are saying. You can't find any record in the paper where Wallace Smith or anybody connected with the Weldon said we're better than you. But Joe Gans obviously had heard that. So that was with the talk. So there's obviously some chatter going on, this pressure for the game. And so Joe Gans says, okay, we'll play him, but we're going to play him in Patterson Park, at the #1 diamond in Patterson Park. So if you look at an old aerial photo of Baltimore, Patterson Park at the time extended to the east about another 2 blocks. And that's where they played on that diamond. And the game was a tie, 5-5, and then was called over for rain. That was a Black Sox. That was the Weldons' first ball game. And Gans was furious because he wanted to bury the Weldons and keep them quiet. So he challenged them to a game at Oriole Park. You know, this, they would have to pay admission. People would have to pay admission to come. This Oriole Park is not where the brewery is now. It's across the street from where the brewery is now. This is Oriole Park 4. This is American League Park. And so people come there, and the Weldons win. Gans, it's fit to be tied. He had placed a side bet of $100 on the game. So then he says to the papers that I challenged the Weldons to play a game at Oriole Park, and the winner gets 100% of the proceeds in the gate receipts. And the Weldons said, no, thank you. They're not going to do it. They didn't need that anymore. They didn't need the publicity against Joe Gans. They didn't need that rivalry to establish a reputation for the. At this point, they were on top. So, and their reputation grew from 1905, 1906, 1907. Wallace Smith stepped back from day-to-day management of the club. He still, and his brother still had a role with the team. We know this because the team's phone number was the same as Smith's hotel phone number, and their offices were the same. If you look up Black Sox, in the papers, you can see their address was, I think, 435 Druid Hill Avenue. And that's Smith's Hotel's address. And their phone number is the same as Smith's Hotel. So we know then that Smiths were still financial backers of the club. And so this went on for a few years, and the Weldons began to establish a local and then a regional reputation. And they would play their summer games down in Browns Grove, which was a resort. You could get you know, if you've seen any photos of Baltimore from the period, you see all the steamships in the Inner Harbor. Well, the steamships that would go to Browns Grove would take off from Browns Wharf in Fells Point, next to where the wreck pier is now. It's Sagamore Pendry Hotel now, but the wreck pier hadn't been built yet. So they would, and that's because African Americans would get on at Browns Wharf and go to Browns Grove, and so you didn't want them. So the city, you know, racism at the time. So and the Black Sox would play down. They were draw. So what they were doing is the people who owned Browns Grove had the Black Sox in residence. People would come from the city down there, see the games, and see the Black Sox dominate all comers. And they played African-American teams. They played predominantly white teams. I'm doing some work now on the Brooklyn Royal Giants, and all the African-American semi-pro teams played white teams. And people loved it. There were some cases of racism, but in Baltimore City, in the fields themselves, the fans who went into this ballpark loved the games. They went there and they saw it as a race rivalry, but it wasn't one of those things where you hated the opposition. Those games happened, and I document one of them in Hagerstown. But the teams saw each other as rivals. They had fun playing. They engaged in the Blacks, and the Weldons dominated everybody. So then in 1908, the Black Sox called out the Cuban X Giants, and they challenged them to a game. And this was audacious. They were playing at that time in Union League Park in South Baltimore. The park I began with the session by showing you the photo of it. And they played them. The first game they played them even. Second game they lost horrifically, and the newspaper said they had the case of the jitters. But June Matthews, Ed Wise, their pitcher Fox, their center fielder O.J. Barber made such an impression on the Cuban X Giants that the Cuban X Giants signed the contracts. And so that's where the 1908 season ends, with what appears to be the death of the Weldons. But then, you know, if you've done research like I do, I did it year by year, and read the story of the team, and then, tried to pick up on clues in the off season. So I thought, when I initially did this, I thought, is this the end of the story? Am I wrong to link the Black Sox to the Weldons? And by this time, they're called the Weldon Giants. And so I was very worried about that. And then I read the papers from early 1909, and article appears, the Black Sox have re-signed from the Cuban X Giants Ed Wise, Joe Matthews, O.J. Barber, and the pitcher Fox. And they would appear in the first game of the, and I just said it and I can't remember it anymore, the Colored Professional Association. I can't remember what that league was called, but I'll have it here, yeah. The Colored Professional Baseball Association, in 1909. And here's where one of the many ironic turns in the story comes. And that's the new owners of the Black Sox that were able to infuse money into the team, and vast amounts of money. They were like established Baltimore elites. And let me see if I can find their names. R.E. Hall, H.H. Lee. If you think to yourself, H.H. Lee, wait a minute, wasn't there a Robert E. Lee in the, yes, he's related to him. And their wives and, were daughters of the Confederacy. They themselves had ancestors who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, or were descended from men who fought as officers for Baltimore in the War of 1812 to 1814 down in North Point, or in Fort McKenna. So they were established, and then they were also mentioned as potential mayoral candidates. But they bought the Black Sox. They were financial backers for them. And there's an irony thinking that the descendants, the sons and daughters of men who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War would now own a team that was founded by a man who was born into slavery. But what they did was showed respect for the ball players. They showed respect for the African American community, and they reached out to the immigrant community, the Polish immigrant community down in Broadway and Fells Point, the community in South Baltimore, which was, Checkerboard Row, and then the Irish were moving in there too. And then they did this by having a business office on Thames Street, and they did this by naming one of the ball players the new manager. So they didn't have a white manager managing the team. And then they paid them very well. And so the Black Sox played in that league, and then the league folded. They were known then as the Baltimore Giants. And they say that because every other team in this league is named after the city it represents, we're going to change our name to the Baltimore Giants. There was the parade too, and the parade began up in Druid Hill Park and went down Druid Hill Avenue, which is a place that people in Baltimore should know more about. It was the center for an African American professional class. That's where Howard Young had his offices. The Afro had their offices there. Smith's Hotel. So this was attorneys, doctors. So this was out of respect to the African American community. Then it came down either Light or Charles Street down South Baltimore to play, and both teams went down to Flex. The Baltimore Giants and I think it was a team out of Washington Washington Giants. They on floats and big parade and everything else. And so they go down there and it's raucous because and Barry Mahul throws out the first pitch at that game, which is astonishing if you know anything about Barry Mahul. Barry Mahul was not a nice man. He was also the son of a Confederate officer, but he had issues with African Americans. He pushed for the segregation of ordinances in the city, which became the model for segregation ordinances throughout the South. So this is the era, Jim Crow was post-Civil War, but this is the era when people tried to make it into law in a way that they had not done before. And it was designed, and this is horrific too, it was designed for public safety purposes. For both the African American community and for the white community. That was the pretext and the pretense behind the law. Anyway, Mahul throws out the first pitch. Here's a man who advocated segregation. And he's sitting in a stadium in South Baltimore owned by, and Checkerboard Row, remember, owned by white men whom he knew, but it's an African-American ball team, and the crowd is predominantly African-American. And there he's throwing up, it's astonishing if you look at that history, the ironies of it. Anyhow, with the folding of the league, the Black Sox then fade, the Baltimore Giants fade from the headlines for a bit. They were bought out, we think, by some other people after Lee and Hall surrendered control, but we don't know who they were. But we know in 1912, a group of, and the papers call them white ball players, who wanted to take over, this is the quote from the paper, take over and run black baseball in the city. They take over the Baltimore Giants. And then the next headline that you read from the paper is the Weldons reform. And all the players who played for the Baltimore Giants are now playing back for a team they reformed and called the Weldons. So that's 1912. So all the big names. So then in 1913, the Afro-American, there's an ad that's in the Afro-American announcing the birth of the Baltimore Black Sox. And then the papers say the Baltimore Black Sox were the Weldons and the Baltimore Giants and the Weldons before that. So it's the same franchise. The Smith brothers, Wallace and his brother Thomas, are reinvested in the team. Once again, their team's address and phone number is at Smith's Hotel on Druid Hill Avenue. Howard Young is mentioned as the principal owner, the president of the club. And I'll talk a little bit about him in a moment. And then John R. Williams, who was, evidence indicates he was the baseball minds behind the team. He's 20 years old. So that's where we come up to the team that's called the Black Sox. So even though the book has the dates of 1913 to 1936, it could easily have 1905 to 1936. And let me stop there before I go on even further. Does anyone have any questions now about it? You can type in the chat, or if you can, unmute yourself and just ask. And I'll talk a little more about it. All right. I didn't see anybody with any questions, so I'll go on. So Howard Young is a remarkable human being. He's also a graduate of Howard University. He went to their pharmacy school. His family's from Washington. His father and mother were both born into slavery. He was not. He was younger than Wallace, so he was born a free man. And his family educated him, or paid for his education at Howard. He started his business in DC, and then he moved up to Baltimore. And when he moved up to Baltimore, he moved up simultaneous with the Segregation Acts. And he decided, I'm going to oppose these. And so he purchased a home in what was set aside as a white neighborhood, which you can imagine how popular that was. And the Afro-American ran a headline that says, Dr. Young expects all to help. So he campaigned against them, and it was a quixotic effort, but he did an admirable job. He later became president of the NAACP chapter in Baltimore. And reading the history of the times, you see how influential Baltimore and Baltimoreans were in the history of the NAACP and the history of the civil rights movements in the early 20th century. And it's you get a chill of pride being a native Baltimorean when you read these stories. So he was the president, but there's no indication that he knew anything about baseball. But there is every indication that John R. Williams loved baseball. And John R. Williams was the team's secretary. He was the team's driver. There is a photo in the book of the team in 1913. And we can identify it from 1913 because of John R. Williams. And later in life, he would write for the Pittsburgh Courier. I'm letting my Baltimorean accent slip out. Pittsburgh Courier. And would also do work for local African American clubs, proto-Negro league teams, etc., organizing games, organizing publicity for them, etc. So he and the ball players were, many of the stars were the members of the old Baltimore Giants, and there's some I hadn't mentioned. Charlie Evans and Charles Thomas played on the team. Evans was an outfielder and Thomas was the catcher. And accounts of them say that they were remarkable ball players. And Thomas in particular, who was the catcher, was an exceptional ball player, and exceptional at handling pitchers and nurturing pitchers and helping pitchers develop their careers. Any case, that's the team in 1913. They were color champions of the South that year, the year after that. There's the photo from the team from 1913 shows the trophy. And also there's the trophies in one of the various Negro League museums in the South. And I've forgotten exactly where it was, but I discovered a photo online of it. And I wrote the people at the museum several times and I couldn't ever get in touch with them. But it's a beautiful trophy. Baltimore Black Sox, color champions of the South. So I won't go into more detail, but there's wonderful stories in the book about the Smith Hotel. The Baltimore Sun labeled them lawless Negroes, the Smith brothers. And why? Because Thomas Smith was instrumental in organizing voter registration for African Americans and for the Democratic Party. Howard Young was a lifelong Republican. And this is the age where, the age of Lincoln, et cetera. So Thomas Smith helped to organize African Democratic support, or African Americans for Democratic Party. And he was known as a great political boss. And if you went into Smith's Hotel at that time, so it's on Druid Hill Avenue, and the face of the row house, it's all been torn down. The face of the row houses, there were 3-story, 4-story brick row houses, and the face had been painted all white. All the bricks were painted white. The windowsills were painted black. And then you have a big banner in front of Smith's Hotel. And the first floor, they were display windows or picture windows, and there was a bar there, there was a restaurant there. It was for African Americans. And the astonishment that people who came into the city who were African Americans and ball players for other teams, that they were staying not only at a hotel, but such an extraordinary hotel. Thomas Smith had erected a shrine to Joe Gans in the bar area. They had a bronze bust of him, a large photo of him. Some of his boxing trophies and memorabilia were there. And the Afro-American office was right across the street. So the reporters would frequent Smith's Hotel bar. Ball players from out of town, many of the Black Sox would stay there permanently. And so they all congregated together. And so one of my wishes is, if I had a time machine, I'd go back in time and just sit and listen to the conversations in the, in the 19-teens and 1920s at this bar with some of the greatest ball players in the nation coming there, not just who played for the Black Sox, but who played for other teams that would go through it. And Smith's Hotel was a center of the club for as long as the Black Sox were around. So this is, Oscar Charleston, Cristobal Torriente. They all stayed at Smith's Hotel. So it was a treasure nationally for baseball and for the city. And of course, in the 1950s, it was raised and replaced with a parking lot. As many things were. This is not nothing new to anyone who knows anything about our urban history in Baltimore in particular, but throughout the nation, of how we've lost great buildings and great places to the urban renewal of the 50s and 60s. And it was only recently we decided, well, let's try to preserve these places, and many of them. But anyway, so that was Smith's Hotel. And Thomas and Wallace are still part of the team, financial backers. Then 1914, 1915, 1916, the team begins to fade from the headlines. You read increasingly fewer stories about them. And then in 1916, they're bought out by a man whose name escapes me. He lived on Orchard Street, which is just around the corner from Druid Hill Avenue. So he was, I checked census records, and it was a segregated neighborhood. It was African American. It was close to Druid Hill Avenue. So, but I can't find his name. But he's almost certainly African American. So he was the next owner of the Black Sox, and he said, well, I don't know where to put him. So he moved him over to the east side of town to the Simpson and Dollar Oval. And the Simpson and Dollar Oval would later become Bugle Field. Joe Cambria bought it out and be home to the Black Sox and then the Eli Giants. So they were there but at that time it was it was an enclosed field, but barely. It probably had a capacity of maybe 500 in bleachers, not in seats. And it wasn't well served by public transportation. The roads leading to it were narrow. And the Black Sox were on the periphery of the city then too, because it was on the opposite side of town from the African American community. There were no stories in the papers about them. I think for the total of 1916, there's one story in the Baltimore papers. I found another in a New Jersey paper and another in a Washington paper, and they're just announcing games. So the Black Sox are in danger, and that's in 1917 as well. Then you see an ad that says the Black Sox will play a local white semi-pro team at the Baltimore and Ohio grounds in Westport. So this is the first clue that Charlie Spedden had taken over ownership of the club, because they would never again fade from the headlines until they were no more in the mid-30s. So why do I think Charlie Spedden bought him out in late and very late September, October 1917? Because Charlie Spedden worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and one of his jobs was to take care of and to lease the Baltimore and Ohio grounds. So I speculate that he bought the team out. He and William Brower. We don't read much about Brower, but it's an interesting story. His obituary is really fascinating because it mentions the Black Sox, whereas none of the other Black Sox owners, some of them have obituaries. Charlie Spedden didn't. But Rossiter, Howard Young, none of them mentioned the Black Sox by name, but Brower's does. Anyway, Brower was just apparently a financial backer. Charlie Spedden was baseball mind. So Charlie Spedden is assigned to lease out the Baltimore and Ohio grounds. We know that ultimately he's the owner of the team, William Brower. So he is owner of the Black Sox, and he's renting the grounds from himself as the agent for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So it's a great conflict of interest. So Charlie Spedden's renting the grounds out to his own team. Now, the railroad probably made money from this too, because the Black Sox pulled in a lot of people with gate receipts, etc. But that announcement in 1917 is the last time any paper refers to those grounds as the Baltimore and Ohio grounds in Westport. They were later called Westport Park, the Westport Baseball Grounds, and eventually Black Sox Park. So this is it. The Black Sox have a home that they did not build. They would build one, but the Westport Baseball Grounds become their home. Somebody noted here, if you don't know, Phillies actually won a game, game one of a doubleheader versus the Yankees. When I checked before I went online, the Orioles were tied in the third inning with the Marlins. So feel free to put in an update if you know it. Anyhow, so here's Charlie Spedden. He's taken over the team, and he's got him a place to stay in the Westport Baseball Grounds. At the time he took it over, it had a seating capacity of 3,500. He would expand it to 5,000 eventually. And I told the story about how he lost all of his star players to the war, to the First World War, through the draft. So, and then that's how he found Doc Sykes. He found Ping Gardner, and then a pitcher from Cuba whose name eludes me at the moment, but it's in the book. So I can take a break here if anybody has any questions before we move on to the 1920s. And there's a side story I want to share with you too, but does anyone have any questions now? All right, I'm going to take a break a little bit from the Black Sox and tell you another story. Now, some of you may know parts of this, but you may not know it all. There is it's about some, and then I'll relate this to the Black Sox in a little bit, because I'm about to tell you what happened in 1920, and I mentioned this in my interview with David that's going to be in Baltimore Chapter. But did Baltimore play a role in the 1920 inaugural Negro League season? And the answer is yes. They didn't have a team in it, but I'll share the role with you in a little bit. So let's move up north from Baltimore to Wilmington, Delaware, and the Harlan and Hollingsworth shipyards. And the Harlan and Hollingsworth shipyards had a baseball field. And right now, a Class D basketball team called the 87ers, it's affiliated with the Philadelphia 76ers. They have a place there where they pay ball. I've never been there. They used to play at the University of Delaware. I went to a couple of the games there. But now they play ball up there, and they don't know it, but they're on the site of Old Harlan Field. And in 1918, shoeless Joe Jackson played for Harlan and Hollingsworth, and he led the league in hitting, and he led them to the championship. Now, how does that intersect with the Black Sox? Stay tuned. This first story, it's not direct intersection. So what job did Joe Jackson have there? Well, apparently he painted the inside of things. He was listed as a painter. In fact, he fell off the bosun's chair, fell out of it, fell down. He wasn't hurt, but that's apparently what he did. The job he had was held by an African-American man. But that African-American man was drafted. Now you say, well, how could Joe Jackson, who got that job because it was a position that was exempt from the draft, why wasn't he drafted where the African-American man was? Well, the African-American man, his name had been published in the Wilmington News Journal and the Wilmington News, the Evening Journal, 3 papers, that said, you are hereby required to report if you are in an essential occupation or a physical disability that prevents you from serving in the war, you need to let us know. Well, he couldn't read, like Joe Jackson couldn't read and write. But there was nobody there to help him out. So he was drafted. Joe Jackson gets his job. Joe Jackson leads the Industrial League in hitting. The reports say that Charlie Comiskey set that job up for him. And if Jackson had not had that job, he would have had another one at the shipyard. So I'm not blaming Joe Jackson for this. So the African-American man goes to war. And as Joe Jackson makes his appearance and begins to play that summer, you can trace, he was with the Harlem Hellfighters, the African-American. And you saw Jackson went 5 for 5 in this game. And that same day, that African-American man was wounded in a gas attack. And so the African-American man's treated on the field, he's treated in the hospital, he survives, he's shipped back to New York. And on the day that Joe Jackson wins the championship of the Shipyard League on the East Coast, he's in the polo grounds for that. They win it there. And that same day, that man whose job Joe Jackson would take dies in a New York hospital. So this is just a side story, but so it's a kind of intermission story. But I'm going to come back to how that plays a role in Black Sox and what happened in 1920. So there was a subscription in the Baltimore papers taken up for the men who lost their lives in the War of 1918. And Joe Jackson's wife donates money to it. So it's just this sad, tragic story. And again, it's not Joe Jackson's fault. Comiskey would have gotten him a job anywhere to keep him safe and keep him from combat. Just happened to be this man's job, and this man died. And he answered. He was drafted because he too, like Jackson, couldn't read, but there was nobody there to help him out. But what that did is the shipyards pulled in people from the region, Philadelphia, from the South, as workers in the shipyard. And they created an appetite for baseball in Wilmington, Delaware. And it was an appetite that Speddon's Black Sox decided to take advantage of. And Hilldale would come down from where they played ball Baccarat Giants come down, Brooklyn Royal Giants from New York, and they would play ball in Wilmington, and they would play ball against each other because it was lucrative. So fast forward to 18, 19, and 20, and the Baltimore Black Sox are a draw in Wilmington. And they have a relationship with a team in Wilmington called the Wilmington Black Sox. And the Wilmington Black Sox play the Harlan Giants, and Harlan Giants played at Harlan Field, right? So they would play each other, and the Harlan Giants would pull ball players in from Philadelphia, from Hilldale, and other places. One of their homegrown stars was Judy Johnson. And so the Wilmington Black Sox got wind of this, and they say to the Baltimore Black Sox, let's borrow some of your players. And so Scrappy Brown, who was shortstop for the Black Sox, comes up, starts playing for the Wilmington Black Sox when he's not playing for the Baltimore Black Sox. And they beat Harlan repeatedly. And there was a furious war in the Wilmington papers about them. You know, the owners and managers of both the Harlan Giants and the Wilmington Black fighting it. Why don't you just stand up for yourself? And why do you have to pull in ball players from, you know, out of town? Why don't we just, anyhow, it was a fantastic rivalry. So crowds would flock to Harlan Field for these games. 1920, Rube Foster decides he's going to come east with his Giants. And he sets up a game against the Baccarat Giants, a series of games. And they play in Washington, they play in New York, they play in Baltimore, and they play in Wilmington, Delaware. And the reason they play in Wilmington, Delaware is because of the Black Sox. And that in part because of the Black Sox and the rivalry that was established and the games that they played in Harlan Field. And that appetite was fed by the Industrial League, and that's why that field, Harlan Field, was built up in that way. News is that, thanks, Jeff, Orioles are leading 1-0 in the bottom of the sixth. All right, so Rube Foster brings his Giants east, and he calls it a World's Championship. So that game was played at the Westport Baseball Grounds, and it was one of the last games that was played there. And there's a wonderful story about Rube Foster sitting in the stands at the Westport Baseball Grounds. And so I want to do it justice, so I'm going to read. I promised myself that I wouldn't read verbatim from the book, but I'm going to now. In October 1920, Rube Foster sat, smoking a pipe, in the stands of the Westport Baseball Grounds. That's a quote from the effort. Foster spoke with confidence and authority on African-American baseball. He also possessed a commanding physical presence. Harry Williams, writing in the Los Angeles Times, characterized Foster as a human mastodon, weighing something like 1 million pounds and measuring about 7 feet across the shoulders. A reporter for the Baltimore Afro-American described him as the greatest baseball magnate the race had yet produced, and he not only looks it, but acts it. Foster had come east with his Chicago American Giants to play a best-of-9 series against the Atlantic City Baccarat Giants. The games would take place in Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, and New York. The series was advertised as the World's Colored Championship. So that's why they were there. And Foster had filed articles of incorporation in Maryland for a team in the Negro National League, and that team never came to fruition, but he had the Black Sox in mind. And what he said is they have, each team, if they want to join, if there's going to be a professional league in the East, or if the Negro National League were to expand into the East, you have to have a couple things. Teams have to have their own ballpark, either leased it or owned it, and Harlan Field in Wilmington. But that team never, a Wilmington team would eventually join the Eastern Colored League, but not for a few years. But he really had his eyes on Baltimore. And he said, you have to have brains and money. And Charlie Spedden had baseball brains. And he showed that by the way he was able to resurrect the Black Sox. And this is not to say that Wallace Smith and Thomas Smith or Howard Young, John Williams, they're brilliant men. They had access to money. Even Hall and Lee, the white owners from 1909, but they didn't have the baseball acumen that Spedden had. And that's what Foster meant. Foster meant baseball brains and money or access to money. Now, Spedden had access to money because he was renting the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad grounds for the Black Sox. But at the same time, so Foster's sitting in the stands at the Westport Baseball Ground for the World's Colored Championship against the Atlantic City Baccarat Giants. And he's looking across the Gwynns Falls, which is, you know, a little more than a canal. And he can see across the street, across the river, Maryland Park under construction. And Maryland Park has hopefully it doesn't have a bad reputation anymore, but it would eventually, you know, like a lot of stuff during the Depression would fall into decay. But in its prime, it could seat 11 to 12,000 people. Seat them, not just in bleachers. Covered grandstands. It was a real baseball field. And it was Foster could see it under construction. Also, the Westport grounds were not a cheap venue by any means. So Baltimore had to be central to his mind. All right. So about an hour and 10 minutes ago, I started by talking about Union League Park and making the case that they should be included in the next edition of Green Cathedrals because they hosted games in the colored professional league. So if you're going to accept that the Chicago Giants and the Atlantic City Baccarat Giants played in the World's Colored Championship, therefore the Westport Baseball Grounds also hosted the equivalent of a major league game. So here's another ballpark in Baltimore that can be included in the next edition of Green Cathedrals. All right, but so Foster leaves. The Afro-American is enthusiastic, ebullient, because they think, well, Baltimore is going to get a professional team. And the crowd was really into the game. And I make note of, I've taken a look at the way newspapers in New York and Philadelphia, Atlantic City, down in DC, and Wilmington covered the game and the publicity leading up to the game. And it's different in Baltimore than it is in those other cities. In those other cities, advertisements and stories about the game builded, you know, well, we have this local guy who's playing for the Baccarats, or this guy from, you know, from New York is playing for Foster's club, so come out and see it. Or it's built in as, you know, this is the World Series game is going to be played at Ebbets Field, but we're not saying it's the Dodgers. The Dodgers are playing in St. Louis. It is. So it's this publicity. Baltimore had that too, but Baltimore had something else. Baltimore had stories that would sound familiar to people who are listening to Talk Radio 105.7 or reading the Sun paper now. It was talking baseball about the game. You know, this is, you know, the Giants and who's going to win and why they're going to win. The coverage in Baltimore was different than it was in the other cities. And it's one of those things that again, you take immense pride in by being a Baltimorean, the city's love for baseball. And the city's, you know, I'm about to be extremely provincial. Forgive me if you're a fan of Boston baseball or Boston Sports Talk Radio. I was listening to Boston Talk Radio when I had the good fortune, for those of you from Boston, for, you know, going through Boston one day. And it was just, I thought, why? Because it was all posturing. Oh, we're going to, you know, annihilate them, wipe them. And then people would come and they would try. That's not talk. Then you listen to sports radio in Baltimore, it's substantive, right? So maybe I'm being provincial. I got that same sense reading the newspapers for that series. So anyhow, Foster leaves. He has this great impression of Baltimore. What Spedden does after that season, I got to think Foster told him to do some things. He begins to sign ball players to contracts, they're salaried, rather than a percentage of gate receipts. So, and you read the papers, they tell the salaries. They tell how much the team would make. It's not the kind of financial records that we would love to have, but it's as close as we're going to get. So, you know, Doc Sykes was paid $350 a month, highest ball player at that time. Sykes also bought stock in the Black Sox. Talk about treasures. What would I like to find? I would like to find a stock certificate for the Baltimore Black Sox. But anyway, so he bought stock in the team, and he was paid $350 a month. He was their best ball player. In 1921 and 1922, the ball players, Spedden and Brower, are able to put the team on a good, firm financial footing. Also in this period of time, Spedden is able to recruit other investors. One of them is Rossiter. And Rossiter came not just with money, but connections in the press. His brother was a reporter for the Baltimore American and then for the Baltimore News. Daniel Nathan predicted this. He said in one of his articles that Rossiter probably had to have connections with the paper because he like saw the stories that would be about the Black Sox in the news sections in the paper. And he said and then when I was looking up census records, I followed the trail of Rossiter's family. So you have his parents were from County Wexford in Ireland. And I follow the trail. His brother, what did his brother do later in life? Brother's a newspaper reporter, Baltimore American, Baltimore News. So kudos to Daniel Nathan for predicting that. Anyway, and some of the other investors in the team that was fun doing research into them. They were African Americans, but they had connections with syndicate operations and organized crime in Baltimore. So those probably were very colorful meetings because you have Spedden, who earns his money working for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. You have Rossiter, who's a manager of restaurants, and by all accounts, a person who, even though he ran restaurants and pubs, was probably not comfortable with figures from on the boundaries. And then you had people from syndicate operations in Baltimore. So that's another place I'd like to go to the board meetings there for a couple times to just hear the conversation. Rossiter wasn't very popular with the African American press. He's and this is something that Daniel Nathan observed, that he's always characterized in the Afro-American as George Rossiter white. Now, this wasn't unusual for the Afro-American or even for the Baltimore Sun to identify the race of the person they were describing. But Nathan talks about Charlie Spedden's he's never identified as white. That's not true. Once it is, and that's the first story where Rossiter becomes part owner of the team. It says Spedden white, Rossiter white. And Nathan speculated was Spedden mixed race? No, it wasn't mixed race. He just had respect for the ball players. And in fact, when Spedden left the club, he was forced to leave the club. There was a scandal. The papers call him a colorful man. And you can't escape the pun on color there. But Rossiter was awful at public relations. So anyway, he's an investor with the team, but he's not calling the shots. Spedden's. We know this because papers tell us Spedden's calling the shots. So he has his papers on salary. He gains investors for the club. He builds Maryland Park, and then he builds it up again. By 1923, by the debut of the Eastern Colored League, Maryland Park has the capacity of a AAA ballpark nowadays. And it has seats, some bleachers, covered grandstands, etc. And Baltimore's in the Eastern Colored League. Happy days. No paper exists from that first series of games. The Afro-American then was published weekly. And it just doesn't exist. I have an alert set up for eBay for any Afro-American, and I have this dream that you're going to see it for sale somewhere. Somebody has it in their basement, or it's in a wall down in West Baltimore somewhere, or East Baltimore, South Baltimore, and somebody's going to be refurbishing their basement. They're going to find this old newspaper. So Peter, I know you live down. So if you do any work in your house and you pull up the floors and you see old newspapers, keep an eye out.
Absolutely.
It's going to come up. So it's going to appear someday. I hope it appears in my lifetime because I like to see the photos from that game and the stories from it, but none exist. So the Black Sox start out well, but then they fall into this pattern, and this is a pattern that plagues them throughout their early years, throughout the Spedden years. They started out really, really well, and then as the weather heated up, they would fade. And they wouldn't just fade. They would fade dramatically. There was a game one year where it was like Orioles magic. For those of us who grew up in Baltimore and were followers of the later Weaver years and the Altobelli years, 79 through 83. Those teams, I look back and I don't see them. They won they were 2 American League pennants in 4 years. I don't see those Orioles teams as dominant forces. but they played together as a team, and they had a chemistry, and the city had a chemistry with them, and they would, win in weird ways, but they would win. And so every year the Black Sox would find ways to win games early on in the season, and they would come back, and there'd be miracle comebacks. Be down by 5 runs in the 9th inning, and then they'd win. And it was regular. And then when the summer heated up, they would start to lose, and then they would be at each other's throats. And one of these games, the team had an on-field manager who was different than the manager of the team, was different from the general manager. And the on-field manager would make game time decisions. And forgive me for not remembering the names. I don't want to name them. It's in the book, but I don't want to name them unless I can. So this one ball player comes up to bat, and he had won 2 previous games that week with sudden death hits or home runs. Walk-off hits or home runs. And they weren't technically walk-off because the home team they would bat in the top of the inning rather than the bottom of the inning because of light, different things. So they weren't technically walk-offs, but he would win the game for them. So he walks up to bat, they're behind, the crowd's anticipating that he's going to, hit the winning run and all this stuff. So it comes up to the plate, and the game time manager calls him back and says, no, you're not hitting, I am. Why? He said, well, because I'm a left-handed hitter, the pitcher's a righty. And he, throws his bat down and says, you're an idiot. The game manager goes up there and strikes out. Destroys the chemistry of the team, and they falter. And the people, the fans in the newspapers would see this coming every year. Oh my God, here the Black Sox fade again. And it would always be that dramatic way of losing. And Baltimore's great rival at the time, Hilldale Giants or Hilldale Daisies, they were a model of functionality, whereas Baltimore was a model of dysfunction. And I read in my book that makes for a great rivalry and a great sense of bitterness between the people of Baltimore, because they love this team. They pour their hearts into this team. And not just the African-American community, although there's a measure of love there that I cannot appreciate, divided as we are by race and time. But there were white fans too, 20 to 50% any given game. And the way the papers describe that, they describe it as a sprinkling and a mix of white fans. So they weren't segregated seating. And they would break everybody's heart every year. But 1924 would come, and John Beckwith would arrive, and I'll talk about him in a second. But let me talk to you about some of the other characters who played for the team in those early years. One great one who's in the Hall of Fame, Judd Wilson, and one man who's misunderstood, Chick Mead. But before I go on and tell you those stories, does anybody have any questions? Ghost Marcel is the only position player named to the first team. Yeah, and he's not inducted into corpus. I agree with that, Ted. And there was this, I talk about it in the book, there was this, Warfield and Marcel had a fight in Cuba in the off season of 29 and 30. And it was a horrific fight. And Marcel wound up not coming back to Baltimore. Also, there's issues with, Ziggy Marcel would play for the Eli Giants later on, but that's for another day. Let me tell you about Judd Wilson and Chick Mead. So Judd Wilson, as you know, had this phenomenal career, played for 20, 25 years for Negro professional teams. He's in the Hall of Fame. He's wearing a Homestead Grays cap in the Hall of Fame, which breaks my heart because, I'm a Baltimore home guy. And the Negro League Centennial team has his bobblehead, but he's playing for, I think, there's a star on his ball cap, so I don't know which team that is. And I thought, why not? There is a bobblehead of Judd Wilson that's really beautiful from 1993, and I wish, it was on eBay one of them was on eBay a few years ago, and I thought, can I afford that? It was $100. And I said, I can't, I have 2 kids and a lot of money. I thought, I can't justify it. And now I wish I had spent it because it's gorgeous. But anyway, Judd Wilson. And people talk about Satchel Paige's age. I think we're pretty sure of Satchel Paige's age. Census records confirm his age. We have birth records for him. But Judd Wilson, we don't know how old he was. I in the book, I err on the younger side for him because I think he lied about his age on his draft card for the First World War. He was drafted in the First War, and he went to serve in the Western Front, like many of the Black Sox ball players. Philadelphia Stars thing. And he said he was born on this military records in 1894, but census records tell us that he was born in 1897. So, which is the right year? Well, I speculate that, and the census records are consistent. It's only his military record from the First World War that gives the earlier birth date. I speculate why. The census records, his father disappears, his mother disappears from the record, but he has two sisters. And he's listed as a groundsman. And you had to be 21 to be a groundsman. And if he said, this is a military record, he probably lied about his age to get that job. Groundsman's like a lineman for a power company. It's a skilled position. You had to be 21. So I think he told the U.S. government what he told AT&T, that he was born in 1894. In order to, and why would he lie? Well, he lied to support his family. When he got back from the war, there's census records indicate that his sisters, there's no record of them. I couldn't find a death record from them either, but it's not unreasonable to think that they may have passed away in the flu pandemic. But there's no evidence to support that. But they just disappear from the record. So he was recruited in 1920. He had played in after the war. He had come back and settled in D.C. He's from Virginia, so he settled in the D.C. area and played for some local D.C. semi-pro teams. And Hairston, who would be catcher for the Black Sox, later manager, and Scrappy Brown recruited him to come and play for the Black Sox. So he started in the Black Sox in 1920. And this is, or 1921, when they, the last season at the Westport Browns, first season in Maryland Park. So he's with the team then, he's with the team through 1930. He's traded then in a flyer sale. So he goes to Homestead. So he spent the first 10 years of his career, had the best year. Now, I haven't checked the seam head stats, but he had the best years of his career in Baltimore. So how can I say that without checking the seam head stats? Well, because I'm from Baltimore, but the 495 average is hard to beat. And he was also involved in a bus accident that year that he hit 495. The whole team was. They were going up to Wilmington to play a ball game, and they were sideswiped on the road by a gas truck. It's a miracle that there wasn't an explosion or anything. But it's Judd Wilson. Daily details of the games. The fans in Baltimore loved him, and he loved them too. And he had a chemistry with the players, particularly with Scrappy Brown. And the other ball player I want to talk about is Chick. Often called the white ball player who passed as colored in order to play ball in the Negro leagues. And there are two bases for that. One was a Baltimore police report filed in the 1930s when he was passing checks that identified him as white in terms of his race. And the other was the fact that he had played for the Cumberland Colts, which was Cumberland Colts were a Class D team in the Blue Ridge League, a white team. But, yeah, Judd Wilson is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. It's a war hero. So I did some research, and people had looked up his census records, and I think his father's or his brothers, and they found out, well, he's listed as white. But if you look at his grandparents, he's listed as colored, and they're listed as colored and mulatto. And his brother in the 1930 census is listed as black. So he's mixed race. And the team he played for was not the Cumberland Colts, it was called the Cumberland Colored Colts. And so had no connection with the Cumberland Colts from the Blue Ridge League. That's in the book too, and I footnote the census records and other things from there. So Bruce, you had one of the things I want to make mention of is the way that McFarland structures its footnotes is it's renumbered by chapter. So if you're looking in the back, and I know this is a little bit cumbersome, but if you're looking in the back for the footnotes, you want to make sure that you're in the right chapter. All right. So Chick Mead was, in fact, mixed race. So he couldn't have played professional white baseball anyway. He was not a white player passing himself off as colored. And people have also said this in a way to disparage the quality of Negro League baseball. They said, Chick Mead couldn't make it, but he played for various Negro League teams. So, you know, but he couldn't have played in the majors. He couldn't have played there because of his race. And I think, though, from what I read about Chick Mead, he had a cannon for an arm at third base. And he was an okay hitter. He could have held his own. He was a really good defensive ball player. In fact, there was speculation in the year that he left the Black Sox. Could they get someone to replace him because of his fielding? And they didn't really until they got Henry Blackman. And there was a tragedy there. And that's 1924. So I'm going to tell you the story about John Beckwith with the club. And then I'll talk about their demise. And I'll wrap things up in about 5 minutes then. So 1924 comes along. The Black Sox have got this pattern. Every year they begin well, then they begin to fade. And so the first year in the Eastern Color League, it's the same story. 1924 comes along. And 1924, the Black Sox are beginning to fade again. And Charlie Spedden apparently was a very soft-hearted man because the team had a bus, but it was very uncomfortable. It wasn't the team bus that they would have later, but it was a bus, and they were traveling, and the ball player said to him, "Can we please take the train from Philadelphia back to Baltimore?" And he relented, and he said yes. So he buys train tickets for all his ball players. You know, they're thrilled. He's at the station, and he runs into who's the Homestead manager? Composey? Am I right in this?
Yes.
He runs into him at the train station. They get to talking, and Posey says, "Oh, I released Beckwith." Spedden's eyes grow big. He goes and tells his ball players, "Get back to Baltimore. You can get there on your own. I'm going to chase down John Beckwith." So he telegrams Pittsburgh, sends a telegram to Beckwith's house in Pittsburgh, says, "Don't go anywhere. I'm on my way." Beckwith doesn't get that telegram. Spedden gets to Pittsburgh on the train, finds out that Beckwith is back in Chicago. He's in Chicago. Oh my God, Ruth Foster's going to grab it. Anybody's going to grab it. The word's starting to get out that Beckwith is available. So Beckwith telegrams, or Spedden telegrams Beckwith in Chicago and says, "I'm on my way. Don't go anywhere. Don't talk to anybody else." Gets on a train, goes out to Chicago. 14 hours maybe. You can imagine just imagine putting yourself in Spedden's shoes at this time. You've sent a telegram. You're on the way. You imagine how he's not sleeping. And Baltimore had a hole at shortstop. They needed a shortstop. So he gets to Chicago. He sends a telegram back to Baltimore and says, "On my way with Beckwith." Oh, Afro-American this is it. The Black Sox are in contention. Beckwith was arguably the best ball player in the Negro Leagues at that time. There were others, Oscar Charleston, Judd Wilson, but the paper said, "Can you imagine Beckwith and Judd Wilson hitting back-to-back in the Black Sox lineup?" An exceptional club. So Beckwith comes back to Baltimore, and I want to thank an auction house. Which one? Let me make sure I get it right. Because they had up for auction the Penn Studios. I have the rights in another place. Penn Studios has that photo that's on the cover of my book from the Black Sox team from 1925. They also have a photo of Beckwith when he first arrived in Baltimore. He sat for a portrait. It's a beautiful photo. But the auction house gave me permission to reproduce their digital image of that photo. So anyway, Beckwith comes back to Baltimore to great fanfare. The team plays 750, 800 ball with him in the lineup that first couple months, and they're gaining on Hilldale. Every month goes by, they erase the lead. There's speculation in the papers that the Black Sox are going to win. Yeah, Hilldale has a lead now, but just Baltimore's got a soft schedule. Hilldale's got a tough schedule. We're going to win. with Beckwith, two things happened. Henry Blackman, their third baseman, dies. It was an off day. He had a sore throat. He went to the doctor, and within 24 hours, he was dead. His funeral was attended by thousands who thronged North Avenue. Beckwith was one of the Paul Black Bears, and even though he had only known him for a month, he was in tears. So they lost Beckwith. They lost their center fielder. I want to say it's Pete Washington, but I might be wrong. Broke his leg sliding into second base. But the Black Sox kept winning. And then in September, Eastern Colored League said the season's over. Hilldale wins the pennant. Black Sox were furious. Baltimore was furious. They had been cheated. So this is the Hilldale team that seemed to beat them every year. The picture of functionality, whereas the Black Sox were, I was reading this, and I hate to say it, but they reminded me of the Yankees of the late 70s, with Reggie Jackson, the Bronx Zoo. One more story about that. There was a game in Harrisburg Giants, and the umpire was notoriously horrible, but he called Beckwith out. So after the game, the Black Sox are on their team bus, and Beckwith gets off the bus, tells the bus driver to stop because he sees the umpire walking to a hotel or something. Beckwith tells the bus driver to stop, gets off and starts pounding on the man. Police are called. The police arrest Judd Wilson. Why? Wilson had nothing to do, but the police arrest Judd Wilson. I'm not going to go, I think I know why, but because they couldn't tell people apart. So they arrest Judd Wilson, who had nothing to do with this. Beckwith gets on the bus and they go back to Baltimore. Spedden goes up, gets Wilson out of jail, clears it up. Witness says, no, it wasn't him. It was the Beckwith who did it. Beckwith has to clear his name. So this is the kind of thing, and Beckwith had a horrible temper. So the Black Sox wind up trading him to, where do they trade him to? I want to say Pittsburgh, but I'm not sure. I don't think Composey wanted him back. Wound up trading him for three pitchers. And one of the pitchers said, I got arm trouble, I can't report. But later he said, I didn't want to play for Baltimore. That broke my heart too. But so that's a Beckwith story. They never did win a championship that year. Anyhow, fast forward, Rossiter or Spedden's asked by the Eastern Colored League he's forced out. And that's a long story about why that happened. But Rossiter takes control of the team, neglects Maryland Park, alienates the African American fan base, but swings trades for the $1 million infield. Black Sox become 1929 champions. Their 1930 team is even better than the 29 team. They get Satchel Paige from the Black Barons. They get Neil Suttles from St. Louis because Rossiter pay him more. They have Rap Dixon. There's this wonderful photo of Dick Lundy or Frank Warfield, Rap Dixon, Neil Suttles, Pud Flournoy, and Satchel Paige, all in Black Sox uniforms. And you think to yourself, God, what a team that was in 1930. Couldn't afford to keep them together. But Paige went back to Birmingham. Suttles went back to St. Louis. But in September, Rossiter started to recruit players, try to get Paige back, got Ted Paige. And the Black Sox beat a Major League All-Star team that included Frankie Frisch, Hack Wilson, and I explained, and several All-Stars, ball players. They beat them 8 games out of 10. One game was a tie, and the only game they lost 1-0. And Eddie Rommel, Baltimore native, was pitching that game. So, and the Baltimore Sun said, we don't know if the Major League All-Stars are convinced that they can win a game against the Black Sox, but if they think so, they're the only ones that do. That's how much they outclassed the Major League All-Stars. Anyhow, the only other thing is, so the Black Sox fade from memory. They move out of Baltimore, Chester, Pennsylvania. They're known as the Chester Baltimore Black Sox. Their last game they played, the last game we have evidence they played, Rap Dixon was their manager. It was in 1936, and it was in Wilmington, Delaware. There's no score of that game. There's only an announcement that it would be played. And if you read the weather reports from that night, thunderstorms were rolling in along the Christina River. And the last game they played was at Pennant Field, which is near the station, Amtrak station now in Wilmington. And they were gone. And they were built in the Chester Baltimore Black Sox. So that's part of the story. Thank you for listening to me for 2 hours. Joe Cambria's involvement. Hey, Anthony. Yeah, I didn't talk about Joe Cambria.
Well, that's actually Paul. That's my son's handle there.
Oh,
But-
okay. So Paul. Oh, it's good to meet you, Paul. We've exchanged emails.
Well, no, we met at the meeting. Remember, I presented my Cambria research, and I talked with you at the January meeting before the COVID struck.
Oh yeah, my memory of that. My memory is gone anyway. I can't remember people. It's a miracle I remember all the way from kids names.
That's okay. I can't remember my name most of the time.
Is that a Baltimore Colts pennant you have on your wall?
And signed by all 5 of the greats, starting with Johnny U and all of them. It's one of my most prized possessions. It's my dad bought it for me. The only Baltimore Colts game I ever went to in Baltimore, my dad bought it for me. I was it was 1959, so I was 10 years old. So it was it's a great thing. I love it to death.
I know a guy who was, you might have been at the game with him. Friend of mine, his family had moved, I forgot from where, to Baltimore in '59. He fell in love with the Colts in '58 and '59. It's Mark Bowden, the guy who wrote Black Hawk Down. He tells me stories about going to those games in '58 and '59 too, and how accessible the players were.
Well, yeah. They're easy to go up to and stuff like that. But the autographs I got years and years later, obviously.
What's your other pennant?
The other pennant? Oh, it's a 1950s Washington Senators pennant.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the benefits of Zoom is that you get these glimpses into people's intimate, places. My intimate place is my office at the University of Delaware, and I miss it. I can't go in. I have to petition the university to go in. But we have a small house. I have a large family, 2 dogs, 2 kids, my wife, me. I don't have an office here. My office is I personalize it, but I can't get it. It's like I'm in exile.
Yeah. Anyway, I wanted to thank you personally for allowing me to use your research. It really helped my 1933-34 chapter.
You would have found it anyway. So,
but it really was nice, and thank you for sharing. I appreciate it greatly. I've had some good and not so good experiences with asking people for help and sharing in research and things of that nature, but I appreciate it greatly. Just wanted to say thanks.
Oh yeah, and you're welcome. A couple things. Ted Knorr is asking that some of the last victims of segregation in baseball are us. I agree with you. And yeah, I think we all are. And reading the stories about the early 1930s and how Major League Baseball was in desperately hard times too. Not only, I think to myself, Landis was such stone-headed or mountain-headed. Let me use his middle name. Just stubborn and idiotic for not seeing the potential. If he had said, we're going to have 2 to 4 Negro League teams join the majors, attendance would have shot through the roof, even in that year in the Depression. I have in my notes how the Black Sox drew the equivalent to the Boston Braves and Philadelphia Phillies and St. Louis Browns in number of fans for the games. And if the Black Sox, Kansas City Monarchs, Hildale, had been, just expand the major leagues, you don't have to segregate the teams. Can you imagine? No, there would have been. But can you imagine the enthusiasm and the joy we'd have had seeing all that happen? Yeah, I agree. Bruce has written, do you have a theory as to why there aren't more Black researchers delving into this history? No, I don't have a theory. I do think, I have no idea. I think that it's wide open. Larry Lester has done tremendous work in this area. And he's laid the groundwork for it. There was he's the father of Negro League research, and anyone who comes and does work on any ball club owes a tremendous debt to him. There's a perspective I think an African American would bring to this work that I can't possibly bring. If there were a model for this, I would. In fact, this is what I've written is more of a documentary history of the team than anything else. And my motto for it was actually a series of documentary histories from on Irish theater in the early 20th century, written by Bob Hogan, who was one of my professors. And I remember having a conversation with him and saying, God, I'd like to do work like that. And he said, nobody's going to hire you if you do work like this. I said, I know. So this is my third book. My first two were on Irish literature, theater and trauma in the north of Ireland, and then a book on Joyce's article on Yeats and the nationalism. But nobody reads them. Now I'm back. I really love this document, but I don't have a clue. But I think that the field's wide open to it. I think we're talking about larger societal issues connected with it, but and baseball is not. So where do you? Researcher do this is the other the great fortune of training. I mean, Kevin Crane, also Bob Hogan, Irish Theater, Zach Bowen, James Joyce, they all trained me in methods of research. So that's why I produced it. But I think more is going to be done. And I think one of the things I think that we miss as a community is this can't be the last book on the Baltimore Black Sox. As wonderful as Bob Luke's book on the Eli Giants is, I think there's other books to be written about the Eli Giants. I think there's other books to be written about the Black Sox. And people shouldn't be deterred from doing it. Show me that I'm wrong. Show me that I've made mistakes. I want to know that. I want the history, true history, to be known. Paul.
When I presented at the 9 conference in February, there were several Black researchers that were there. I'd have to go get my program to remember their names. This one guy was really crazy and was talking with me about the idea of researching the Negro leagues in terms of baseball and jazz music, because he knew I was a musician. And, you know, Louis Armstrong had a team at one time.
Yes, he did.
And a bunch of other jazz and popular players owned baseball teams. And he always said that there was a juxtaposition between baseball and jazz in the black black baseball leagues.
Bojangles danced on rooftops.
Yes, yes.
For Black Sox games. There is I'm trying to find it real quick. There's stories about the Black Sox would have dances in the off season, and a group called, I can't remember their names, some of these crazy cats would play, and other early jazz musicians would play at these. Spedman would hire the man from band would come in, and the early, the jazz from the 1920s would be there, and at these dances where the public could meet the Black Sox and have a dance with them. They would listen to the jazz music. Yeah. Let's get this COVID in the rear view agreed. Have the people come to Baltimore next year and we can host them.
I agree.
Other questions? So I'll end with a story then. So there's a photo at the end of the book of Crush Holloway. There's two. One is the on Yoakley, where the photo, who's doing Cambria. So I bought the photo of Bugle Field when it was being torn down. It's been reproduced, but I bought the original photo for $15 from the Tribune. It was selling Baltimore history. But I bought the Crush Holloway photo. I petitioned to the Sun paper for rights for that in Yoakley. They said, we don't own the rights for the Holloway photo. We don't know who does. So it's in there. And Crush Holloway was in an interview with John Hallway. And Holloway said, it's just lost history. Nobody's going to dig it up. And when I read that, I said, I got to dig it up. I got to tell that story. So that's one of my motivations for it. And just to hear how sad that was. And I owe the origins of this to David Stinson and I were supposed to meet in 2012. I said, I'd love to do a ballpark tour of Baltimore. I grew up in East Baltimore. Love to do it. And it couldn't because we were snowed out. Pete Kurzel was supposed to be there that day too. Sports writer. And I said, we ought to get together because I have some photos I'd like to share with you. So we're at Cabana's restaurant in Silver Spring, and he tells me that nobody knows where Maryland Park or the Westport baseball grounds are. And I said, I have an idea. And the idea was because of my research in Irish literature, I knew about aerial photography and things. And that's how I found Maryland Park, and that's where it began. And I remember talking to my department chair about it. He's African American scholar, John Ruth. And he said, why don't you write your next book about it? I said, because I'm an Irish literature scholar. He said, well, why can't you be? And so I did. That's 7 years in the making. A thin volume for the 7 years of work, but that's half my married life. So thanks to Lisa and my kids who shared me with the Baltimore Black Sox for that period of time. And it just, the newspaper reporters told great stories in these papers. All right, I'm going to stop talking now. So I think, Peter, you better mute me because I could talk forever. So I'm going to shut my mouth. Peter, you're muted. So I'm going to mute myself. There you go.
There I am. All right. Yeah, I'd love to let you go, but since we have to give up the account for another chapter meeting, I mean, we have gone very long in the past, so we have a good core group here of folks who love to listen and ask questions. One, thanks, obviously, Bernard. It's awesome. Those of you who don't have it, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, standard places. And hopefully Bernard will do a presentation on either the Black Sox or something similar for SABR 50 next June. As we know, they finally got the dates settled. So it'll be in June versus July. I think 16th to the 20th, if I'm not mistaken, pending all of this pandemic is behind us. So aside from our upcoming Baltimore Chapter will come out in the next week or so, and our next meeting will be the 19th from noon to 2. If you guys need anything, just email me, message. You know how to reach us. We're all pandemic mode, so we're all doing electronic communications these days. So if there's no other questions for Bernard, we can all sign off and see you guys in 2 weeks and enjoy the summer, whatever that means.
Peter, one last thing. Feel free to distribute my email.
Okay.
So if anybody has any, it's my university email.
Right.
So anybody should feel free to drop me a line, talk about stuff.
I will send it out in the next blast when it comes out with information for our next author.
All right. Thanks very, very much.
All right, guys. Enjoy. Have a good evening and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank
night.
you. Night.